There is a certain kind of silence that belongs only to very old places. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of things that have been waiting so long they have forgotten how to announce themselves. Australia is full of that silence. And somewhere beneath it, in caves that have never been mapped, in sediment layers that have never been touched by a trowel, in the genomes of people whose ancestors arrived here before the concept of arrival even had a name, lies a record of human existence so deep and so layered that modern science is only now developing the tools to begin reading it. What I am about to share with you are not fringe theories. These are not ancient alien fantasies dressed up in scientific language. Every discovery on this list comes from published research, from laboratories at respected universities, from fieldwork conducted by credentialed scientists who spent years, sometimes decades, chasing these answers through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. And the answers they found, in every single case, turned out to be more ancient, more complex, and more humbling than anyone expected. This is not a list about what we know. This is a list about how much we have been missing. Let us go back, much further back than you are probably expecting. Number 10. The Warratyi rock shelter and the tools that should not exist. In 2016, a research team led by Giles Ham from La Trobe University announced a discovery at a site called Warratyi, a rock shelter tucked into the gorge country of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia. The shelter had been identified with the help of Adnyamathanha, Elder Clifford Coulthard, whose community knowledge of the country guided the team to a location that outside researchers had never documented. What they found inside that shelter redrew the map of ancient Australia in ways that archaeologists are still working through. The site contained stratified deposits, meaning clean, undisturbed layers of sediment, laid down over tens of thousands of years, each layer preserving the material remains of the people who used the shelter at different points in time, dated using optically stimulated luminescence and radiocarbon methods. The deepest layers of occupation went back to approximately 49,000 years ago, which in itself was significant but not entirely surprising. What was surprising, what was genuinely astonishing, were the specific objects found at specific depths. At layers dated to between 38,000 and 49,000 years ago, the team recovered bone points, which are hafted tools made from animal bone, a type of technology that was previously thought to have appeared in Australia no earlier than about 6,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Tools considered to be relatively recent innovations in the archaeological record of this continent were found here at ages 6 to 8 times older than the previous estimates. Also recovered were backed artifacts, small retouched stone tools of a type again previously assumed to be much more recent, as well as gypsum, pigment, and evidence of what appears to be the earliest use of adhesive in Australia. An adhesive, glue, at 38,000 years old. The people using this shelter in the middle of South Australia during the last ice age were not primitive foragers scratching out a bare existence. They were skilled technologists producing composite tools with multiple components bound together, operating within a tradition of innovation and accumulated knowledge that stretched back further than anything the archaeological record had previously been willing to show us. Number 9. The Karlianguan site and the 50,000-year-old hearth. Fire is the most intimate technology humans have ever possessed. Not a tool you hold in your hand, but a force you control, a power you feed and tend and carry with you across landscapes. The relationship between fire and the human mind is ancient beyond measure, and nowhere on Earth is that relationship more ancient than in Australia, where the evidence for deliberate, managed fire extends back to the very edge of human arrival on the continent. In the Swan coastal plain of Western Australia, sediment cores and archaeological surveys have identified traces of burning at ages consistent with the earliest human occupation of the continent. But it is a site in the interior, near the margins of what was once a large freshwater system in New South Wales, where the evidence becomes most pointed. Hearth features dated to approximately 50,000 years ago show not just the presence of fire, but its management. Structured ash deposits, repeated use of the same location, and the spatial organization of a campsite around a central fire source. This is not a brush fire or a lightning strike preserved in sediment. The spatial pattern, the repetition, and the associated artifacts tell a different story. They tell the story of people who came back to the same place, who kept a fire going, who arranged their activities around it, who understood the fire as the center of something social, something domestic, something deeply human. For the researchers who study ancient fire management in Australia, including work published through the Australian Research Council and multiple university programs, the fire record is one of the clearest lines of evidence for the sophistication of early Australians. Because fire management at this level is not instinct, it is knowledge, it is teaching. It is the transmission of understanding from one generation to the next over spans of time that challenge the limits of what we consider possible for oral and behavioral culture. Number 8. The Talgai skull, and a century of forgotten evidence. Some of the most important discoveries in Australian prehistory were made not last year, but 100 years ago, and then essentially forgotten, filed away, reinterpreted, and buried under layers of more recent consensus, until researchers with fresh eyes came back to them and realized that what had been set aside was extraordinary. The Talgai skull was found in 1884 by a station worker named Tom Dooner, on a property in southern Queensland. It was purchased by a naturalist and eventually made its way into scientific hands, where it was studied and published upon, and then slowly pushed to the margins of the literature. The skull is morphologically unusual, featuring a combination of archaic and modern characteristics that made it difficult to place within the frameworks available to early 20th century scientists. For decades, its age was disputed, with estimates ranging wildly. More recent analysis using uranium series dating and re-examination of the geological context has suggested the skull may date to between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, which in itself makes it significant. But what has drawn renewed interest is what the skull's morphology might tell us about the diversity of the ancient human population of Australia. Current understanding, supported by both physical anthropology and ancient DNA research, suggests that the first Australians were not a single homogeneous population, but a diverse group of people who arrived via different routes, at different times, and who developed regional variations over tens of thousands of years of relative isolation. The Talgai skull sits within that emerging picture as a data point whose full significance has not yet been resolved, a piece of a puzzle whose outline we are only beginning to see. The lesson of Talgai is partly about the skull itself, and partly about what happens to evidence that arrives before the scientific community is ready to interpret it correctly. Sometimes the most important discoveries are not made in the field. They are made in museum drawers, when someone finally looks again. Number 7. The ancient genetic diversity locked inside living communities. In 2016, a study published in Nature involving researchers from Harvard Medical School, the Max Planck Institute, and several Australian universities conducted the first comprehensive genomic analysis of Aboriginal Australian populations, using samples collected with full community consent and collaboration. The findings were extraordinary on multiple levels. First, and most fundamentally, the study confirmed that Aboriginal Australians are the direct descendants of the first people to leave Africa, a founding population that separated from all other human lineages approximately 72,000 years ago, and arrived in Australia roughly 50,000 to 55,000 years ago. Since their arrival, these populations show evidence of remarkable genetic continuity, meaning they largely did not receive significant genetic input from outside populations until the period of European colonization. This 50,000-year period of relative genetic isolation is without parallel in the human story. No other modern population has maintained comparable continuity for anything close to that duration. But the study also revealed extraordinary internal diversity. Aboriginal Australian communities from different regions of the continent show genetic differences from each other that have been accumulating for tens of thousands of years, differences that in some cases are as large as those between populations from entirely different continents and the rest of the world. This internal diversity is the genetic signature of a vast and ancient society, a continent-spanning network of distinct peoples who maintained their own languages, their own cultural traditions, and their own biological distinctiveness across timescales that dwarf every other human cultural tradition on Earth. The study also added further detail to what we know about the Denisovan ancestry carried by Aboriginal Australians, identifying specific genomic regions where the Denisovan signal is strongest and suggesting that these archaic sequences may have conferred adaptive advantages in the environments encountered during the migration through Southeast Asia and into Australia. We are not simply talking about history here. We are talking about a living genetic archive, about people alive today whose genomes carry direct, readable evidence of encounters and migrations and adaptations that occurred before the last ice age had even reached its peak. Number 6. The Jinmium rock engravings, and the age that shocked the world. In 1996, a discovery was announced that briefly made headlines around the world, and then became one of the most contentious episodes in the history of Australian archaeology. At a site called Jinmium, in the Northern Territory, near Keep River, in the far northwest of Australia, a researcher named Richard Roberts and his colleagues dated what appeared to be rock engravings using thermoluminescence, dating of sandy sediments that overlay the engraved surfaces. The dates that came back were staggering. Some readings suggested ages of up to 75,000 years, which would have made these the oldest known examples of human art anywhere on Earth, predating the famous cave paintings of Europe by tens of thousands of years. The announcement caused a sensation. Then came the scientific scrutiny, and what followed was a decade-long debate that is genuinely instructive about how science works and how it sometimes does not. Subsequent dating, using different methods, produced much younger ages, in the range of 10,000 years or less, and the consensus shifted against the extreme early dates. But the story does not end there. The Jinmium debate prompted a substantial reassessment of dating methodologies for rock art in Australia, leading to significant improvements in the techniques used. And it kept attention focused on the question of when humans first began making marks on stone surfaces in this country, a question that has not gone away. The site itself retains genuine archaeological interest. The broader Kimberley and Keep River region contains some of the most ancient and complex rock art sequences in the world. And the work done in the wake of the Jinmium controversy has produced a more rigorous and more nuanced understanding of that tradition. The lesson here is that a discovery that turned out to be partly wrong still moved the entire field forward. That is not a failure. That is science doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Number 5. The Devil's Lair Cave, and 48,000 years of continuous habitation. In the southwest corner of Western Australia, not far from the cliffs above the Southern Ocean, there is a limestone cave that was occupied by human beings for a period so long that the bottom of its archaeological sequence disappears into the Pleistocene. Devil's Lair, excavated over many years by researchers including Charles Dodge from the Western Australia Museum, and subsequently by teams including work published through the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, contains a cultural deposit dating from approximately 48,000 years ago, right through to relatively recent times. What makes Devil's Lair particularly important is the quality and diversity of its contents. Among the objects recovered are some of the oldest known personal ornaments in Australia. Perforated shells and animal teeth that appear to have been used as beads or pendants, dated to between 19,000 and 22,000 years ago. Personal ornament is one of the most significant markers of modern human cognition. The creation of objects whose primary purpose is symbolic. Objects that communicate identity or status or group membership through appearance alone requires a level of abstract thought and social complexity that defines a threshold of human development. The people at Devil's Lair were not just surviving, they were decorating themselves. They had a concept of self-presentation sophisticated enough to motivate the time and effort of producing jewelry in one of the coldest and most resource-stressed periods in human history. During the glacial maximum, when sea levels were at their lowest and the climate of southwestern Australia was harsh and dry, the continuous occupation record at Devil's Lair also speaks to the extraordinary stability of Aboriginal cultural relationships with country. This was not a site visited occasionally. It was returned to consistently across time spans that make the entire history of European civilization look brief. That kind of sustained, multi-generational connection to a specific place is itself a form of knowledge. Ecological and spiritual intelligence accumulated over hundreds of generations that no written record and no museum collection can fully capture. Number 4. The stenciled hands of Arnhem Land, and what they were saying. There is a gesture so universal, so immediately human, that it crosses every cultural boundary and speaks to something fundamental about what it means to be conscious. You place your hand against a surface. You blow pigment around it. You step back, and you see yourself reflected there, preserved. Negative hand stencils, made by this process, are found in rock art traditions across the world, in France, in Spain, in Argentina, in Indonesia. But in Australia, they are found in quantities and contexts that suggest a tradition so deep and so continuous that trying to trace its origins takes you back to the very beginning of human presence on the continent. In the sandstone overhangs of Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, hand stencils have been dated using indirect methods, through their stratigraphic relationship with other dated materials, to ages in excess of 40,000 years. Some researchers, working from geochemical analysis of the mineral crusts that have formed over certain stencils, have argued for ages that push toward 50,000 years. What strikes researchers who study these images is not just their age, but what surrounds them. The hands are rarely alone. They appear within compositions that include animals, geometric forms, and figures whose meaning exists within a cultural framework that only the custodians of that country fully hold. They are not decorations. They are statements. Each hand is a moment of presence recorded. A human being saying not just that I was here, but that I chose to mark my being here. That the act of leaving this trace mattered to me. and across 40,000 or more years, across ice ages, and sea level changes, and the slow drift of continental climate, something in that impulse, that need to reach out and leave a mark on the world, has survived. That continuity is not accidental. It is the result of a cultural commitment to transmission, to memory, to the responsibility of each generation to carry forward what was given to them. In a world that tends to measure cultural achievement by monuments and texts and institutions, the hand stencils of Arnhem Land are a different kind of monument. They are made of nothing but air, and pigment, and intention, and they have lasted longer than stone. Number 3. The Songlines, and the world's oldest navigation system. There is a technology that has been operating in Australia for at least 50,000 years, possibly longer, that is only now beginning to receive the serious scientific attention it deserves. It does not involve metal or stone or written code. It involves song. The Songlines, known by different names in different Aboriginal language groups, are a network of routes across the Australian continent encoded in sequences of song, each verse corresponding to a specific landmark, each melody carrying geographic, ecological, and spiritual information about the country through which the song travels. In practical terms, a person who knows the appropriate song can navigate across hundreds of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain by singing, matching the landmarks they encounter to the verses they were taught, their voice becoming a kind of map. The anthropological literature on songlines goes back to Bruce Chatwin's popular but imprecise account in the 1980s, but the serious scholarly work on their structure and function has accelerated significantly since then. Researchers including Dwayne Hemaker from the University of Melbourne, working in collaboration with Aboriginal knowledge holders, have demonstrated that songlines encode not only geographic information, but astronomical knowledge, seasonal calendars, and detailed ecological data about water sources, food availability, and seasonal animal movements across landscapes that have been observed and catalogued over timescales. No written scientific tradition can match. A study published in 2020 in the journal Human Ecology by researchers examining the information density of songline traditions found that the geographic data encoded in certain song sequences was accurate enough that, when tested against satellite-derived terrain maps, the correspondence was precise to within a resolution of less than 1 kilometer across route segments spanning hundreds of kilometers. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry masquerading as science. This is a functional, accurate, tested navigation and ecological information system operating in oral form that has been in continuous use for longer than any other human technology on Earth. The songlines are the oldest library in human history. They have just never been stored on paper. Number 2. The Budj Bim aquaculture system and 6,600 years of engineering. In 2019, a site in the Western District of Victoria achieved something very rare for an Australian archaeological location. It was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The Budj Bim cultural landscape, managed by the Gunditjmara people of southwestern Victoria, contains what has been identified as one of the oldest aquaculture systems in the world. An engineered network of channels, weirs, and holding ponds constructed from volcanic stone to trap, store, and harvest short-finned eels from the flow of the Daeward Wirral, the Hopkins River system. The system was built approximately 6,600 years ago, shortly after a volcanic eruption created the lava flows that the Gunditjmara then reshaped into infrastructure. The engineering is sophisticated. The channels are designed to exploit the tidal and seasonal behavior of the eels, which migrate in predictable patterns and can be directed, concentrated, and harvested with an efficiency that made the Budj Bim system not just a food source, but an economic engine. Smoked eel from this system was traded across vast distances, as evidenced by the presence of eel remains at sites well beyond the range of the species' natural habitat. The people who built and operated this system were not nomads following food across the landscape. They were settled. They had permanent stone houses, evidenced by dozens of structural remains identified across the landscape. They had surplus production. They had trade networks. They had a form of economic complexity that most standard histories of Australia have been extraordinarily slow to acknowledge, because acknowledging it requires revising a foundational assumption that Aboriginal Australians were universally hunter-gatherers without fixed settlement or food production. The Budj Bim evidence is unambiguous, and it has been sitting in the archaeological record for decades, waiting for the broader culture to catch up with what it means. What it means is that the history of complex, settled, economically sophisticated human society in Australia is not a recent import. It is indigenous, it is ancient, and it is backed by 6,600 years of engineering that is still visible on the ground today. Number 1. The conversation rock art of the Pilbara, and a message sent across deep time. The Murujuga Rock Art Complex in the Pilbara region of Western Australia is the largest collection of petroglyphs, which are rock engravings, on the surface of the earth. More than 1 million individual engravings cover the rocks of the Burrup Peninsula and surrounding islands, accumulated across a time span that researchers from the University of Western Australia, Monash University, and other institutions have been working to establish for years. The oldest engravings, based on the depth of their weathering patina, their stratigraphic position relative to datable geological events, and geochemical analysis of the rock surfaces, are estimated to be up to 50,000 years old. Some researchers working with the most ancient layers of the patina have argued for even greater ages. The images at Murujuga are not random, they are a visual archive. Among the subjects depicted are animals that are now extinct, including the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, which persisted on the Australian mainland until roughly 3,000 years ago, and megafauna species that disappeared much earlier. Researchers have identified representations of landscapes that no longer exist, of coastal environments, now beneath the sea, of a world that was here before the last ice age ended and the seas rose to their current levels. Among the most remarkable images are what appear to be faces, detailed, expressive human faces with clearly depicted features. Among the oldest known figurative representations of the human face anywhere in the world, a study published in 2021 by Ken Mulvaney, a rock art specialist who has worked at Murujuga for decades, identified specific engravings that appear to document the progressive inundation of the coastline over thousands of years. A visual record of sea level rise created by people who were watching the water come in and chose to record what they were witnessing. Think about that. People standing on rocks that are now surrounded by sea, watching the world they knew disappearing beneath the waves, and responding by making art. Not by running, not only by surviving, by making art, by recording, by insisting that what was being lost was worth remembering. The Murujuga complex is not just an archaeological site. It is a conversation conducted across 50,000 years of time, a transmission sent by human minds into an unknown future, waiting for other human minds to receive it. We are the future those artists were sending to, and we are only now beginning to understand what they were saying. The discoveries on this list are not anomalies. They are not statistical outliers or lucky accidents of preservation. They are the leading edge of a body of evidence that is growing every year as new dating technologies improve, as underwater surveys expand, as genomic research deepens, as researchers trained in both Western scientific methods and indigenous knowledge systems begin working together in ways that older generations of scientists simply did not. Australia is the oldest story humanity has. Not the oldest civilization in the narrow sense, not the oldest cities or the oldest writing, but the oldest continuous human presence, the longest unbroken thread of people living on a piece of land and knowing it, knowing every plant and every water source and every season and every sky, across a time span so immense that every other chapter of human history fits inside it like a sentence inside a novel. The history books were not wrong about Australia because the evidence was hidden. They were wrong because the questions were not being asked. They are being asked now, and the answers are extraordinary. If you found this important, share it. These stories deserve to reach further than algorithm and habit usually allow. The people whose ancestors are discussed here have been saying this for a very long time. It is worth listening.